Hey everyone, welcome to SJ's classes. In this video lesson, we will be discussing Alexander Pope. He is the second critic that we come across in this third module of the paper Literary Criticism. In the previous video, we discussed John Dryden. We discussed three critics under the third chapter, which is titled English Neoclassical Criticism. I hope you are familiar with the term neoclassicism and neoclassical period in literature. It extends from 1660 to 1798. The period can be broken down into three ages: the Restoration period, the Augustan age, and the period of Samuel Johnson, or the age of Samuel Johnson. It's also known by the terms age of Dryden and age of Pope. Now, the reason why this period is called as neoclassical period is because the writers of neoclassical period, they tried to imitate the style of the writers in the classical period, the writers of Rome and Greek. That is why this age between 1660 and 1798 is known as neoclassical. Neo means new classical period. The important writers of this period, as I said earlier, are Samuel Johnson, Alexander Pope, John Dryden. Let us look at some of the important contributions made by Alexander Pope towards English literary criticism in this video lesson. Before we move into that, let's have an introduction to Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope was born on May 21st, 1688 in London, England, and he died on May 30th, 1744 in Twickenham near London. He is a poet and satirist of the English Augustan period and is best known for his poems and essay on criticism. Now don't misunderstand seeing the title of this poem, an essay on criticism. It's not an essay as such, but it's actually a poem. So he's popular for his poems and essay on criticism, which was published in 1711. The Rape of the Lock, I'm sure you have heard this term earlier, this title earlier. So he is also popular for this mock epic, The Rape of the Lock, in which a young man in one family steals a lock of hair from a young lady in another family. Pope treated the dispute that followed as though it were comparable to the mighty quarrel between Greeks and Trojans, which had been Homer's theme. Telling the story with all the pomp and circumstance of epic made not only the participants in the quarrel, but also the society in which they lived seem ridiculous. And that is exactly why this work is referred to as a mock epic. He is also popular for the Dunciad, published in 1728. Dunciad is a mock heroic satire in which Alexander Pope attacks various figures in the literary world of his time, and by extension the widespread decline in the intellectual and moral values he believes is occurring in Great Britain and wider European world. He is also popular for his work An Essay on Man, which is a philosophical essay written in heroic couplets of iambic pentameter. The poem consists of 4 epistles. The first epistle surveys relations between humans and the universe. The second discusses humans as individuals. The third addresses the relationship between the individual and society. And the fourth questions the potential of the individual for happiness. Alexander Pope is also the most epigrammatic of all English authors. Epigrammatic means epigrams are short sententious statements, something that Francis Bacon wrote through his essays, sentences that are rich with ideas. For example, to quote Alexander Pope himself, "A little learning is a dangerous thing." Another one of his quote, "To err is human, to forgive is divine." One more, "For fools rush in where angels fear to tread." Now these have become proverbs in our contemporary day. These are actually what you call as epigrams or epigrammatic sentences, and Alexander Pope was popular for such epigrams. Now let us analyze Pope as a literary critic. He was one of the most popular and influential writers of his time. He was writing during what we now call the Enlightenment era, which lasted from about 1660 to around 1800. It's in 1798 that Lyrical Ballads was published by Wordsworth and Coleridge. That is when the Romantic Age begins. So we have the Enlightenment era till 1800. Pope's contribution to neoclassical criticism is as important as that of the others of his period. He aimed largely at improving the literary taste and establishing standards for literary compositions. His criticism is spread over an essay on criticism, which was published in 1711, and that is the work we need to analyze as part of your syllabus. Then Preface to Shakespeare, published in 1725, Art of Singing, Epistles to Augustus, Preface to the Translation of the Iliad, and his letters. So these are some of his important contributions towards English literary criticism. Now let us look in detail his work, An Essay on Criticism, which is the work that has been explored in your textbook. An Essay on Criticism was written when he was barely 23 years of age. It was published in 1711. He limits himself in his essay to remarks and critical principles of literary compositions in general. He does not examine, as Dryden does, any work written during or before his time. The essay is modeled on the Horatian form. I hope you have heard about this term earlier, Horatian format or Horatian ode. And Alexander Pope has modeled his work essay on the Horatian form. And it follows a neat plan. A survey and consideration of the art of criticism in general happens from page numbers 1 to 201. An examination of the important causes for literary misjudgment happens from page numbers 202 to 560. And Characteristics of an Ideal Critic is narrated out by Alexander Pope from pages 561 to 640. And finally, in the rest of the pages, you see a short account of the history of criticism. Pope's essay on criticism is broken into three different parts. The first part opens by describing the ways literary critics can actually cause harm. How can a literary critic cause harm to works of art, to literature, to society? That is what he argues in the first part. Pope argues that critics must be both careful and humble when critiquing a piece of literature, for the writing of bad criticism actually hurts poetry more than the writing of bad poetry. Pope points out that each critic has his or her own opinion, and if applied incorrectly, a critic can actually censure a talented writer. However, Pope argues that if a critic is honest, doesn't fall prey to envy, Pope points out that each critic has his or her own opinion, and if applied incorrectly, a critic can actually censure a talented writer. However, Pope argues that if a critic is honest, he will not fall prey to envy and listens to the seeds of understanding that are naturally a part of him or herself. One can thus become a wise critic. In the second part of this poem, Pope describes some of the ways that critics develop bad judgment, the chief of which is pride. The key to avoiding this is to know your own faults and limitations. Moreover, critics must study well and focus on conventions passed down from the masters of poetry. Pope warns, however, that critics must be careful of becoming slaves to the rules and conventions that others have developed, and not to let the popularity of an author misguide a critic's appreciation of an author's work. So these are his suggestions regarding how to be a good critic, or how the work of criticism must be done. One of the other products of adhering too closely to conventions is that critics become fascinated with extremes and forget the essential truth that beauty and good poetry are made up of the combination of all of their parts rather than each part by itself. So instead of focusing on individual units, you must see the work as a whole. In the third part of the poem, Pope offers some wisdom that critics should follow. Once again, Pope emphasizes the importance of humility and studying deeply, particularly studying those poets and critics who truly understand poetry and follow nature. On the act of literary judgment and business of criticism, Pope has much sane advice to offer. Neglecting the work as a whole and judging it by parts is a fault. Using conceits for the sake of using them is another. Paying attention to diction, style, and the media of composition without adequate attention to the content is the third. So he is pointing out some of the common errors that critics practice while attempting literary criticism. These are some of his advices. He says that you should not neglect the whole and judge individual parts. He says using conceits for the sake of using them is an error. And also paying attention to diction, style, and the media of composition without giving enough attention to the content is yet another mistake. Judgment based on dogmatic views, cliched views, or extreme fastidiousness, which means the trait of being meticulous about matters of taste and style. So judgment based on dogmatic views or extreme fastidiousness in estimating a work is also bad. A true critic has knowledge of the work. There were the qualities possessed by great critics like Aristotle. Every poet and every critic must read the works of the ancients because the ancients had discovered the rules of composition and had observed nature. Nature and Homer were the same as far as Pope is concerned. To copy nature is to copy them. Modern writers should be wary of transgressing rules laid down by the ancients. Pope is not in favor of the conceits of metaphysicals. Poetry of common sense is the best for man. So he identifies some of the common errors made by critics while attempting literary criticism and also gives them suggestions on how to do criticism at its best. The next topic that your textbook focuses is Pope's use of the word wit. Much has been said of the use of the term wit by Pope. It was an accepted part of the poetic vocabulary of the 17th and 18th centuries. Johnson's dictionary of 1755 gives 8 different meanings for the word, and the recent Oxford English Dictionary has 14 meanings under the head word, in addition to many subordinate and compound words. William Emerson, who specialized in a stylistic interpretation of such words, like honor in Henry IV, honesty in Othello, points out in his work Structure of Complex Words that the key Popian term, which is wit, occurs 47 times in the poem and can be found once in 16 lines on an average count. And on every occasion, the use of the term conveys a different meaning. So, William Emerson's comment on Alexander Pope's use of the word is very significant because William Emerson says that Alexander Pope has used this term 47 times in the poem, and on an average, you can find this word being used in every 16 lines. Let us look at some of the important meanings that Pope has attributed to this word. You can at least four classifications of Pope's use of the word are noticeable. The first is to refer to all mental and intellectual faculties taken together. The second is to refer to the gift of the poet, which is the poet's genius. The third usage is to refer to the quality of ingenuity in a poet. And this is the quality of verbal ingenuity which was found in the Restoration dramatists like Congreve and Sheridan. And the final use is to refer to the poetic imagination. So these are the various usages or meanings that you decipher while you read Pope's essay, especially when you come across the term wit. Pope intended these varieties of meanings to be a kind of answer to the attacks on poetry. And so he took the word associated with poetry and spoke about the complex creative process in which imagination and judgment get fused into an indivisible unit. In a sense, he was redefining poetry. Now, to conclude, Pope's essay is not a new system or a new exposition of a view of poetry and criticism, but it constitutes a cultural continuum, a continuation. It passes on the great tradition of the past to his generation. It belongs to a lineage of literary manuals starting from Aristotle and continued by Horace and Quintilian and a host of learned philosopher critics. So that is all about Alexander Pope. I gave you a short introduction to Alexander Pope. I mentioned some of his popular works like an essay on criticism, The Rape of the Lock, and The Dunciad. I also spoke about his contributions to English literary criticism, and specifically we discussed an essay on criticism. Now basically he gives many advices through this particular poem, especially to critics who engage themselves in literary criticism. Your textbook also focuses on the word wit, which has been used many times by Alexander Pope. We have analyzed the different meanings that Pope has ascribed to this particular word through his work and essay. Thank you so much for watching this video lesson. In the next video lesson, I will discuss Dr. Samuel Johnson as a literary critic. Thank you.